Hello, my name is Douglas Justice. I'm the curator here at UBC Botanical Garden, and I've been doing cherry talks and walks for a number of years, probably as long as the Cherry Blossom Festival has been going. But this is the first time that I've done a cherry talk and walk without people. So here we are. It's just you and me and the cherries. This is a very special cherry. This is a brand new cherry. I don't normally talk about cherries that don't have names, but this doesn't have a name. This is a cherry tree that we selected. It's a cross between the Tibetan cherry. Tibetan cherry is a beautiful tree with mahogany or kind of cinnamon-colored bark that peels, and it's crossed with the Japanese big mountain cherry, what they call Oyama Sakura. And those two trees were in proximity in the botanical garden, and one year I collected seed and we sowed that seed, and we got a bunch of seedlings, and then we threw out all of the ones that didn't look very interesting and maybe were a little bit disease prone. And this is the result. We have a tree with really great bark and also pretty nice flowers as well. It's taken basically the best features of both of those parents. And so we're going to name it. We're not sure what we're going to name it. We have some advice from people at the Cherry Blossom Festival, and we're quite excited about going forward with a really great name. I don't know, maybe people can help us with that. All right, this is a row of Tai Haku. Tai Haku is known as the great white cherry. Remember Collingwood Ingram, the cherry breeder. He recognized a plant. He was cycling around West Sussex or East Sussex or somewhere, and he noticed a plant in on somebody's estate, and incredibly he recognized it from an ancient Japanese text. It said, well, that must be this plant. It didn't have a name at that time, and so he went about propagating it, because all the time that he'd been in Japan, he'd never seen it, but he did recognize it from the text, and so he reintroduced it to Japan. So this is probably the most formal planting that you'll see at UBC Botanical Garden. Okay, this is an ancient Japanese flowering cherry known as Mikaruma Gaishi, and this is the translation of this is the Royal Carriage Returns. And one of the things that always attracted me to Japanese flowering cherries was the poetry that you often get with the names. Mikaruma Gaishi is a lovely sounding name, and this the Royal Carriage Returns always made me wonder, why would a plant ever have a name as sort of non-plant-like as that? Well, of course, the story of the name is that in Imperial Japan, I think it's dated somewhere in the 11th or 12th century, there were a couple of courtiers, and they were going down a road, and they went through a village, and one of them turned to the other and said, what a fantastic double flower cherry we saw in that village. And the other courtier said, well, it was lovely, but it only had single flowers. What are you talking about? And so they had to have the carriage returned to go back to the village to check. And of course, both double and single flowers are found on Mikaruma Gaishi. And that's just a lovely way to explain that, sort of metaphorically. Now, what I really love about Mikaruma Gaishi is that it has beautiful, beautiful flowers. Individually, these flowers are quite large, 5 centimeters across, and they're born in, terrific um, profusion all along the branches. Now, this is a tree that can look a little bit odd to Western taste when it gets larger, because it has these big sort of plume-like branches covered in flowers. But here, this is about 5 years old from a cutting, and it's starting, I think, to look pretty spectacular. This is another old Japanese cultivar. This one is known as Ichio, and Ichio is not very common in Vancouver. It's probably a little like Mikaruma Gaishi in terms of the numbers on the streets, but it's a really lovely tree, and it's actually one of the most robust, one of the healthiest of all of the flowering cherries. And it's kind of a weird situation that we don't see more of it in Vancouver. Of course, everyone knows Kanzan cherry, which is the big double pink that's out right now. We're sort of in the latter part of April, and Kanzan will be in flower for another 3 weeks or so. Big pink flowers, very strong pink. And this is a kind of similar shape, but for some reason, and this is a kind of quirk of history, Ichio was confused with another cultivar called Shirafugen, which is also a late flowering cherry. Now, Shirafugen is very different, has much longer pedicels, that is, the stalks on which the flowers are born are much longer. They have the same sort of, and I'm just going to hold that up, it's sort of like a ballerina's tutu, the way that the flowers are presented, and that's very much like Shirafugen. The other thing about Shirafugen is that it's pink in bud, like this, and then opens and turns kind of lighter, almost white. This is one of, I have to say, one of my favorites. It's a kind of subtle, pretty pink, but a very beautiful late flowering cherry. Okay, this is another sort of traditional Japanese cherry. It's known. It's been known from I think the 16th century. This one is called ojochen, which means the big lantern or the lantern. This is called the lantern cherry because when the buds are at a particular stage, they hang down and they're big and fat, and they look, or they're sort of reminiscent of a Japanese lantern. So we have a plant that's now almost fully out. How do we recognize ojochen from, say, a bunch of other similar looking trees? For example, like Mikaruma Gaishi, this also has occasional double flowers and some single flowers. But one of the really surefire ways to recognize this is that half the leaves are pointed and the other and half the leaves are blunted. So we have pointed leaves and blunted leaves. And so this is really obvious when the leaves get bigger, but it's a kind of a weird, just one of those sort of weird things about it. What I love about ojochen is that it smells fantastic, and it's incredibly robust. And I have a soft spot for cherries that are not very well known in Vancouver. And ojochen is known from a single plant at the cenotaph in Stanley Park. That's the cenotaph that commemorates the Canadian-Japanese war dead from the First World War. And it seems to me that the planting of a lantern cherry at the cenotaph is pretty symbolic, as the lantern is the kind of universal symbol of you know, shining a light for those people who are lost, you know, to be found. And so the lantern cherry, which is old and decrepit and fantastic at the cenotaph. The only other lantern cherry is at Nitobe Memorial Garden, and that's a tree that's, you know, shaded, and it doesn't, you know, it's not long for this world, to be honest. All right, this is another of Japanese ancient cherries. You know, the ancient cherries of Japan are known as Sato Zakura, and what that means is village cherries, and that's a name that was given because the sort of pedigrees or the parentage of these plants have been lost. Individual villages across Japan would sort of adopt a particular tree, and nobody knows exactly you know, where those trees came from, whether they were hybrids or selections or whatever. And one of those village cherries, and this is a very famous village cherry, and this is called ukon. And ukon is the Japanese word that means turmeric, the spice turmeric. And that might seem an odd name to give to a cherry, but the interesting thing about this cherry is that the flowers have a yellowish cast, as though somebody had sort of tossed turmeric on them to yellow them. And so, in fact, they're a little bit green this year, and that's reminiscent of another Japanese cultivar called gyoko, which I'm going to show you in a few minutes. But anyway, when we get close to this, you'll be able to see this sort of yellowish cast to the flowers. But really, it's a stunning tree and very, very healthy. One of those trees that I think probably deserves to be more widely grown. And again, another tree that has flowers that have a variety of, you know, different numbers of petals in the flower. And depending on the temperature at which the flowers are developed in the spring, they can be more green or more pink. So this year they're quite green, and as they open, they're going to be yellowish, and then gradually take on a little bit of a pink tinge. So this is ukon. This is Prunus shirotai. Shirotai is white, double white flowered, very, very popular tree. It produces these beautiful sort of open double flowers. They're starting to take on a little bit of a red heart right now, so they might look a little bit pink from a distance, but one of the great things about shirotai is that when the flowers emerge in the spring, they typically emerge with very, very bright, pardon me, very bright green foliage. And so what that does is it creates a sort of incredible ultra white look to the flowers. Very, very pretty, very fragrant. In the spring, the fragrance is like almonds. And we'd probably see this tree more often, except that it produces a crown that's very, very horizontal, very wide-spreading. And what that means is that it limits where you can plant it in, like it needs lots of horizontal space. And so that means it's only really appropriate for parks and bigger gardens. It doesn't work on the street. Shirotai means a white cloth, and I'm not exactly sure what the connection is, but it is just a beautiful, probably one of the most beautiful flowers of all of the flowering cherries. All right, this is uminiko, and although this is this sounds like it's a Japanese cultivar, this is actually a modern hybrid. It was produced in the 1920s, I believe, by Collingwood Ingram, who was an English cherry breeder and collector and ornithologist. He spent a lot of time in Japan, and he took it upon himself to take Japanese species and make hybrids. And this is one of his early hybrids. Uminiko means seagull, and I guess the petals are sort of reminiscent of the tail of a gull. But in any case, this is going over a little bit. When this first started to flower, there were no leaves, obviously, and it was just a beautiful, upright, very narrow, upright pillar of white. Now we can see the red heart, the flower. This is a sign that the leaves are aging, and we get the fluttering of the petals. This is another unusual Japanese cultivar. This is one called gyoko, and gyoko, that's a weird name for an English speaker, something we find difficult to kind of wrap our tongue around. And the name means is a kind of ceremonial robe that was worn by certain people in the imperial court in Japan, and those robes were purple, white, and green, which is a very interesting combination that is reflected in the flowers. So we have the buds and the bud scales around it are purple, and the flowers are white with green stripes. It's a pretty weird plant. That is, you have to, I think, be interested in looking at cherries very closely to appreciate a plant like this, because from a distance, when this is in flower, it looks like a kind of a pale white, and so you really do need to kind of get up close and personal with it. Now, we're about a week away from full bloom on this, and when it is out, I think, again, you know, when you're up close, it's pretty spectacular. We used to think that there were only a few of these in Vancouver. So, for example, at the Pitch and Putt in Stanley Park, around the Ted and Mary Gregg rhododendron garden, there are 3 or 4 gyoko there, and we thought, okay, well, that was it. But then the people from the Cherry Blossom Festival, what we call Cherry Scouts, have been really good at sort of, you know, finding things. And there's, I have to say, one of the best groups of gyoko are on Ontario Street between 18th and 19th, and they're in full bloom right now. Here at UBC, the proximity to the ocean keeps us much cooler. We're at least a week behind most of the rest of Vancouver in terms of flowering. So that's why I can show you things we're you know, in the last couple of weeks of last couple of weeks of April, and we have plants that are in flower that have been long over in other parts of Vancouver. So gyoko is very, very closely related to ukon. And if you see the two together, you'd understand what I'm talking about. Ukon occasionally has a little bit of a green cast to some of the petals, and with gyoko, there's more of a green cast, and you can usually see that throughout the petals. You see green stripes. But we have basically 4 different cultivars that run from yellow to white striped green, and most of the yellow ones we call ukon, and the green ones we call gyoko. But in fact, if you really were to separate them, you could find 4 distinct cultivars that are grown in Vancouver.